hardship. It's already been a very difficult time in China. People don't know how they're going to feed their children, and they have to make decisions about what to do with their kids themselves as China is about to be invaded. And so this particular piece is around 1936. And this little girl is in her farmer's hut with her father, who she called Baba, and her name was Little Sister. So Baba announced that he would take Little Sister on a train ride to Suzhou, 60 miles toward Shanghai. She remembered every moment of that journey, for she had been giddy that Baba had chosen her, not one of her brothers. She sat on her father's lap, her eyes glued to the window, mesmerized by the neat rice fields and towns just like hers, sweeping by in a blur. When she got to Suzhou, men and women were dressed in fine silk fabrics and even foreign outfits, unlike her mother and father, who wore roughly woven traditional dress. Big posters showed pretty ladies with curly black hair wearing tight cheapaos, promoting cigarettes, mosquito coils, and rat poison. When they left the train station, Baba flagged down a driver of a wooden moon-wheeled cart. After a twisting, bumpy ride over arched stone bridges and canals lined by weeping willows, they finally came to a stop at a small store. Inside, her father spoke to the shopkeepers in a low voice, while she stood waiting by the door, looking out at the parade of vendors and hawkers on the street. Soon Baba called for her and told her to stand still beside him. The shopkeepers looked into her mouth and squeezed her thin arms. When they were finished poking and prodding her, one of them took her hand and led her to another room. As she turned to look for her father, she saw his back as he headed out the door. "Baba, Baba," she had shouted after him. He didn't turn around. "Baba, come back," she cried. How could he leave without her? The stranger gently pushed her into a small, dark storeroom and locked the door. Alone and terrified of what might lurk in the darkness, at first she could only whimper. Then she steeled herself and called for her father as hard as she could until she grew hoarse and couldn't shout anymore. Exhausted, she sobbed herself to sleep. When the little girl awakened on the musty dirt floor, she thought she had had a terrible nightmare. But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. She could see the glare of daylight around the cracks. Once again, she screamed for her father. Baba never came. So this is the story of one of the children I start with these four characters. They were all children at the time, at the beginning of the war, and I traced their lives through. But this was the story that I first heard when I only had known about some last boat out of Shanghai. And this character was my mother. So she's a character in this book. And my mother told me this story when I was in my 50s and she was in her 70s. And I had spent a lifetime asking my mother, "Mom, can you tell me something about your life in China? What was it like with you?" And she would always answer, from the time I was a little kid, "Oh, that was wartime, a bad memory." And that was it. And it wasn't until, well into her being a grandmother, and some of her grandchildren are here, that one day, I was just having dinner with her, I was sitting down and went into my mantra, and I just said, "Oh, Mom, too bad you can't tell me anything about when you were a kid." And this time she said, "All right, you want to know, I'll tell you." And so you can imagine, because we all have families that have stories that people don't share, or we know there's something and we just don't know the details. And she started talking, and she had never told anyone this before. And so I sat there silent because I didn't want to interrupt her, break the spell of her sharing, something that, my God, I had never known this about my mother. And at some point she stopped to pause, and I couldn't even think of what to say. I was in a total shock, and I really blurted this out. "Gee, Mom, you have such a great memory." And my mother just looked at me and she said, I was 6 years old when my father gave me away. I remember everything. You know, it was the worst day of my life, and that's what she told me. And so we talked late into the night. I'm a journalist. At some point, I asked my mother, can I keep asking you questions? I'd like to record you, interview you, and everything started coming out. And every time she talked about this, I could really feel like it was the beginning of letting go of some of the pain that she had experienced. But so that was one of the stories that got me going. I ended up interviewing more than 100 people, and every one of them who had been children through this time and then living through 8 years of war. The World War II lasted 8 years for China. It started in 1937 for the United States. It didn't begin until 1941. And so China fought that alone, and there was incredible misery and poverty, and there was an occupying enemy force in Shanghai, and throughout most of the entire coast of China was under Japanese occupation. And excuse me. And so that's outlined in great detail here, because I had 4 people, and it was really important that besides the story I had of my mother, that the other 3 people would be of a very different background, and we're talking about a diaspora. You know, I wanted the reputation. So let me just say this: I'm cognizant that we are here in Philadelphia, Chinatown, and most Chinatowns in the U.S. have been created and settled by people from Guangdong province, right, southern China. They speak Cantonese and speak Toisan. Now other dialects, but at the time that this Shanghai diaspora happened, these were Shanghai people, and because Shanghai had such a reputation of being an international city, Shanghainese people had the reputation about being the blowhards of China. So these are the people who would say, we are the #1 city, and it kind of like how New Yorkers have their reputation, Shanghainese had theirs. And so there were a lot of culture clashes too. And so within this, I wanted to have a diversity of the 4 major characters, as well as the other people who came in, because not all Shanghainese are the rich Shanghai people, which is part of their stereotype. And so anyway, it is a story about people who were so frightened about what might happen, because they, as the wealthiest city of China, with people who were intellectuals, people who were loyalists with the losing side, people who were the bourgeoisie, they were the ones, the capitalists, that they knew might have a lot to fear from the communists. So after they had lived through 8 years of World War and enemy occupation, then when Japan signed the surrender documents, there wasn't a moment of peace in China, because then the Civil War broke out in full bloom. 4 more years of Civil War. The complete decay of the government that was there. I mean, people couldn't even buy food anymore. The inflation had gone so insane, and materials weren't available, basic food and fuel, and not to mention there was a lot of corruption. So all of that had happened, people lived through that, and then the fear that the communists were coming. Now, most of the people in Shanghai had never met a communist, because this was an area under strict martial law, and anybody, if they were even a union activist or somebody who was resisting in any way, they would be shot on the street right there. And there were many, many stories of execution and people witnessing these things.